Hello everybody, welcome to the I Am IT Geek YouTube channel. My name is Shabazda and as ever I am the IT Geek. Welcome back to another YouTube video, and we are still ongoing with the AZ700 series, the designing and implementing Microsoft Azure network solutions. But today we are moving on to module 2. So today we're going to have, we finished module 1 with the express route episodes. I think there are 4 of those in that sort of subtopic. And we're moving on to module 2. So Mohammed Sajid is going to be with me today, as in from the recording perspective. He has recorded some demos for us to follow later on this episode and some other episodes, but I'm going to do some theory for you now. So let's get started. So as I mentioned, we are moving on to module 2, and module 2 is designing and implementing core network infrastructures, which is what we were talking about. And to start us off in this episode and this subtopic, we are talking about designing and implementing private IP addresses for VNets. This is part 1. And that topic today is going to cover creating a VNet, a virtual network, and that's what Sad is going to cover in the demo. We'll talk about planning and configuring subnetting for services, then talk about planning and configuring Subnet Delegation specifically, and then we'll move on to the 2 demos, one of them being creating that virtual network or VNet, and then Sad is going to show us how we configure a subnet delegation. So let's get started in that first topic. So planning and configuring and subnetting for services. Obviously, Sad is going to go through the creating a VNet, so we're not going to talk about that quite yet. But all resources in a VNet can communicate outbound to the internet, and that's just one of the network virtual network capabilities. So this is by default. You can communicate with the internet. You communicate inbound to a resource by assigning it a public IP address or even a public load balancer. And you can also use public IP or public load balancer to manage your outbound connections as well, so both inbound and outbound to the internet. Another capability of a virtual network is being able to communicate between Azure resources as well. So there are 3 key mechanisms really through which Azure resources communicate. VNets, VNet service endpoints, and VNet peering. Okay, and we're going to discuss all of those throughout this module, I believe. Virtual networks can not only connect to VMs, but other Azure resources as well, like app service environment, even AKS, Azure Kubernetes services. You can use service endpoints to connect those Azure resources types, such as SQL databases and storage accounts as well. Again, we should be hopefully touching on that throughout this module. You can also communicate with on-premises locations. Now, we kind of discussed all this in the last module because we touched on VPNs, site-side VPNs. We talked about point-to-site. We also spoke about express routes. So, that allows us to securely extend your data center, essentially. You can connect to those on-premises resources. Another capability is filtering that network traffic. So you can filter network traffic between subnets using any combination of network security groups or NSGs, or even virtual network appliances like firewalls, gateways, proxies, or sort of NAT services. NAT is a network address translation. Finally, we can do traffic routing as well. So Azure routes traffic between subnets, connected virtual networks, on-premises networks, and the internet by default, because that's the default setting within the routing. You can implement route tables or even BGP, which is Border Gateway Protocol routes, to override that default route Azure creates. So not just the default route, you can do custom routes as well. So we're just going to stick with this topic of planning and configuring subnetting for services. So a lot of design considerations you need to think about when you're planning your subnetting. And when you are creating that VNet, it's recommended that first of all, use the address range enumerated within the RFC 1918. So this is the same as on premises. There's no difference there. And those sort of addresses, those private addresses we're talking about, sort of 10.0.0.0 to 10.255.255.255. So that's a 10/8 prefix. Another one is a 172.16.0.0 with a /12 prefix. Or a 192.168 with another /16 prefix. So these are all address spaces that you can have within Azure. And again, let's not get confused. There's nothing different between that and on premises when you're doing networking. So if you've got a good grounding in networking on premises, that should put you in really good stead for this exam as well. Again, similar to the again on premises, what's not possible are the following ranges, and that's like your sort of 244.0.0.0, which is your multicast address, that broadcast address, which is sort of 255.255.255/32, the loopback address, which is we all know of if you know networking, which is 127.0.0.0. So that's a /8, so that's a loopback. The link local address, sort of that 169.254. You know when you're having network issues and you realise your IP address is 169.254.0.0/16. So that's a link local. And also the 168.63.129.16. Now that is actually Azure internal DNS. That's a new one. That won't be something you can't connect to on premises. That you probably can't anyway. But that's internal DNS for Azure. So when you are planning and implementing those subnets, you need to consider, a lot of things. So make sure each subnet has a unique address, as we mentioned. Certain Azure services require their own subnet as well, like what is it, a bastion, for example. Subnets can be used for traffic management as well. For example, you can create subnets to route traffic through a network virtual appliance. So and although subnets are small, the smallest unit, you can create subnets based on IP addressing, and you can further segment your network by using NSGs or network security groups, which we'll be looking at later on in this module. You do that to control access to that subnet. Each network security group contains rules, so inbound and outbound, and you can associate 0 or 1 NSG to each subnet in a virtual network, and you can associate the same or a different network security group to each subnet as well. So one thing that's very important when you're designing your subnets and your networking is to get your naming convention right for your resources. Effective naming convention can compose resource names from important information for each resource. It makes it easier to understand what that resource is as well. So naming convention is very important in my opinion. When you can deploy as many virtual networks as you need within each subscription and up to the subscription limit. So again, if that's a hard limit you've got set. Some larger organizations with sort of global deployments have multiple virtual networks that are connected between regions. So you can do like VNet peering or VPN. You should consider availability zones when you're designing your network as well, and plan for those sort of service and support availability zones as well. For example, Azure services that support availability zones fall into sort of three categories. You've got your zonal services, zone redundant, and non-regional services as well. So zone services are resources that can be pinned to a specific zone. Zone redundant services are resources that are replicated or sort of distributed across zones automatically. And those non-regional services, these are services they're always available from Azure locations, and they're resilient, like zone-wide, to any zone-wide outages, as well as region-wide outages. Okay. So let's move on now to planning and configuring subnet delegation specifically. So subnet delegation enables you to designate a specific subnet for an Azure Infrastructure as a Service or IaaS service of your choice, and that needs to be injected into your virtual network. Subnet delegation provides full control to the customer on managing the integration of Azure services into their virtual network services as well. Some of the advantages that you got, it helps to designate a subnet for one or more Azure services and manage the instances in subnet as per your requirements. An example could be a virtual network owner can define the following, for the sort of either network filtering, routing policies, or service integration for delegated subnet to kind of better manage those resources. You can also, another advantage is that it helps interject those services and integrate them with virtual networks, as we mentioned earlier. So sticking with this plan and configure subnet delegation, who can actually delegate? Now, subnet delegation it's an exercise that virtual network owners need to perform to designate one of those subnets for a specific Azure service. So Azure service in turn deploys that instance into that subnet for consumption. So it's the owner of the virtual network that needs to perform it. What impact does it actually have? So each Azure service defines their own deployment model, and they can be define what properties they do or do not support in that sort of delegated subnet for injection purposes. And an example of that, like an NSG, for example, shared subnet with other Azure resources or VM virtual machine scale sets in the same subnet, or only supports a dedicated subnet with only the instances, those services in it. Supports NSG association with a delegated subnet. Allows route table association with that delegated subnet. And when we're talking about subnet delegation, what it can do, what can't it do? We've talked about what it can do. What can't it do? So the Azure service has been injected into a delegated subnet. Still have those basic set of properties that are available for non-delegated subnets, such as the Azure services can inject instances into customer subnets, but cannot impact the existing workloads. In other words, the policies or routes that these services apply are flexible and can be overridden by the customer as well. So let's move on to demo time. So I can't. Saj is not physically with me or within the same recording, but he has recorded a demo, 2 demos in fact. So I will hand over to Saj. Thanks, Saj.
Thank you, Shabazz. Hi everyone. So Shabazz is just going to overtake your virtual network. So we're just going to do a quick demo on how to create one. So if you log into portal.azure.com, and if this is your first time, in the search bar, search for virtual networks. And then, as you can see, we've got several created here. I'm just going to copy this name. It'll save me having to type it all in. I'll create a number 4. So select create to create a new virtual network. We have a single subscription, Am IT Geek, but if you've got multiple subscriptions, from the drop-down menu, select the subscription you want to create it into. We're creating everything into our AZ700 resource group. You have the option to create new resource groups if you need to. Give it a name. It will default to the region where we've created our resource group and all the other resources in it, and the name needs to be unique, so we'll just change this to 4. On the next page, you can define the IP address. So the IP address space here that Azure is giving you is one that's not being used in your environment at this moment in time, so it's 10.5.0.0/16, which gives you 65,000 plus IP addresses. You have the option to delete this if you want to define your own smaller range or a different range. For the demo, we'll stick with the default, and it creates your first subnet and gives you a name of default, and it's giving it a subnet range of 10.5.0.0/24. This will give you 251 IP addresses. You lose 5 because they're reserved for Azure. But if you want to change these details, select default, and here you can change the name. So we'll change this to AZ700 subnet 01 as part of our demo. We leave the address range as it is, but if you see here, it says 251 usable addresses, 5 are Azure reserved. If using NAT gateway or service endpoints, you can enable those here for this particular subnet. Click save. You can add additional subnets if you need to add additional subnets, but for the demo, we'll just stick with the initial subnet that we've created. On the next page, if you're using Azure Bastion, DDoS protection, or firewall, you can enable those here. We leave them as default. We're not using tags in our demo environment, so we leave that blank. We can find any tags here if you need to. Review what you've done. If you're happy with it, select create. This isn't a long process, so if you just wait a few moments, we'll have our resource created. So as you can see, it says deployment in progress. Now it's done. If you go to resources, you will see that we've created a VNet with a subnet. So this is our address space that we defined. We accepted the default 10.5.0.0/16. We renamed our subnet. So if you look on the subnets, you've got your newly named subnet AZ700 subnet 01 with a address range of 10.5.0.0/24. So in our previous demo, we created a virtual network and we created a subnet. So we're going to look at subnet delegation quickly as part of this demo. So if you select the virtual network that you created, and then from under settings, select the subnets option and select the subnet that you've created. Now in here, you have different things that you can define. You can no longer change the name. You can copy it if you need to. You've got your address range defined here. You've got NAT gateway, network security group. If you scroll down a bit, you've got delegate subnet services, subnet delegation. So if you select the drop-down menu, you'll see lots of services that you can delegate the subnet to. Microsoft App environments, Microsoft App test clients, private clouds, batch accounts. Scroll down, you'll see things like network settings, Fidalgo, I think that says Microsoft Fidalgo, network settings, custom NetApp volume. So for example, we just select NetApp volumes and select save. This just takes a few moments, and I've created that subnet delegation for you. If you go back into your subnet, you will see that it's now saved, and subnet delegation is for Microsoft.NET app/volumes. Thank you for watching. Back to you, Shabazz.
Thank you, Saj, for that. For those two great demos there. We looked at creating a VNet, and then we looked at sort of subnet delegation as well. So thank you very much for that. And you at home or watching this can follow those labs as well. If you look at the description, they've got a link to the GitHub repository where all the labs are available. So yeah, thank you. We've finally got started with module 2. And again, I think this is 2 or 3 episodes. I can't remember. I think it's 2 episodes. Is this subtopic. So again, all mine and Saj's socials are all in the description, and a link to, as I said, the GitHub as well for the labs. So yeah, please do like, comment, subscribe, and let me know what you think. If there's anything you feel I've missed, or anything you'd like to know more detail about. So up until next time, thank you and goodbye.